Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending. We've got quite a number of people coming on and a few popping on now. My name is Nathan Breakpaw. I'm the Hawke's Bay coordinator for New Zealand Land Care Trust. We're starting off this whole biochar field, our workshops with this webinar with Dr. Jim Jones. What we're hoping to do is over the next couple months is have field days in the regions that New Zealand Land Care Trust has coordinators in to actually follow up on this and to have some people who are either making biochar or using biochar to demonstrate what they're doing and moving from there. And just keep an eye on if you are on our mailing list or you've registered for this, you will get notification of when those field days are going on. And we'll keep you informed. You will at the end of this presentation get a survey. Ask everybody to fill that survey out, and it helps us better set up the next field days so we can get the best information out there that people are interested in. Today, we're lucky enough to have Dr. Jim Jones from Massey University. He is the professor and research director at the School of Food and Advanced Technology, and has been doing a lot of research around biochar. And I'm going to pass it on to him, let him introduce himself. And another thing is, if you want to ask any questions, please ask it in the chat menu. The chat button is down at the bottom there. It has a little symbol like you would a text. Put it there, and I will keep track of those questions, and we'll go through those questions at the end of the presentation. I'll pass this over to Dr. Jim Jones.
Thank you very much, Nathan, and welcome everyone to this webinar on biochar. So I've titled this Biochar in New Zealand and subtitled it Frequently Asked Questions, as I saw a little bit of chat going around saying that we will be able to answer this question and that question. So I framed it that way. I just wanted to give you a little bit of history before I start. Biochar in New Zealand originates with Peter Winsley, who wrote an article in New Zealand Science Review in 2007. He was working for the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, as it was called in those days, and had looked at some of the very early research that was going on around the world, initially on the terra preta soils of the Amazon, where they'd recognized that a lot of charcoal had been put in the soil, and those soils are very rich. Now, in the Amazon, if you go to places that haven't been modified in this way and take off the trees, the soil looks a bit like Australia. It's old, red, leached out soils. And these areas where the soils have been modified are very, very rich. So he raised the question, is this possible in the context of New Zealand and in the context of the modern agricultural methods that we use today? And from there, the government created a fund called the Biochar Initiative, and one of the people in my acknowledgements list there, Mike Headley, he was instrumental in applying for that fund and getting it up and running. Marta Camps, who's also acknowledged there, she was brought on board as a soil scientist and set up quite a number of projects on soil science of interactions with biochar. I was brought on as the chemical engineer, looking at the production side and also looking at life cycle analysis. That wasn't my main skill set, so we brought in Sarah McLaren, who's also acknowledged, and Ralph Sims, who many of you will know, who has not that long ago retired from Massey University. And more latterly, the last acknowledged person, Chin Chen, is a thermomechanical engineer and has come on board with some of the more detailed pyrolysis chemistry and engineering. So that is a bit of a history. It's been around in New Zealand mindset for quite some time, around 2009, 2010. And the work has been going on through a period where we had the global financial crisis and a resetting of international priorities. The early the early promise of biochar greatly impacting on climate change sort of disappeared for a while, but now we are thinking a lot more seriously about that. So this is what my talk is about, really. Let's see what these frequently asked questions are and try and provide some answers for them. And why doesn't it click to the next slide? So what is biochar? Using international definition, biochar is defined as carbonized material, biomass material. Okay, so it's come from leaves, sticks, wood, obtained from a sustainable source. That's very important. It has to be something that has been harvested and will be regrown. Then it needs to be put in the soil. If it hasn't been put, it's not going to be put in the soil, do not call it biochar, right? And the purpose of that is to sustainably enhance the agricultural and environmental value under current and future management. So if it's not biochar, it's called charcoal. Sorry, I've just got somebody trying to call me, which I can't help because it's my work computer. So that distinguishes it from charcoal, and charcoal is used for fuel, okay, or as a chemical reductant or a colouring agent and so forth. Why is it worth talking about biochar? Well, biochar offers a different way, an alternative way to manage residues and waste. Okay, and when that is made, it can be used to co-produce energy through the non-char component, which is volatile bio-oil or combustible gas. When biochar is put in the soil, it's a porous material. Soil because it has good adsorbency. That adsorbency can help it immobilize things that we don't want, pesticides, herbicides, heavy metals, and so forth. And it can reduce other emissions in the soil by helpfully aerating the soil a bit more so we get less methane production. And the last one, which is the one that the world has really been interested in, is its long-term carbon sink benefit. So let's have a think. Next question, how is biochar made? Well, biochar is the heating of biomass without air, and when it does that, it breaks down to produce charcoal, as you can see in the picture there, but it also produces gases and tars, and it does this in a sequence of primary and then secondary reactions. So if we are maximizing the amount of charcoal, we actually want to encourage both sets of reactions. I won't talk any more about the reactions, but how do we make it? Well, we make it in these things called kilns or reactors. Two pictures here. The one on the left is Transformations Limited, which has got, as you can see, 4 batch units inside the one reactor, and the other one is more of an experimental reactor made by us at Massey University. You can go and buy these. Earth Systems in Melbourne will sell you a mobile unit, which is in a container, gets dropped at your place, or they also sell a continuous plant, which is where the feedstocks would be brought to the plant. It doesn't easily fit on the back of a truck. So you've got the mobile and the station that are available for sale. There are plenty of other people around the world that also make these sorts of plants. Feedstocks. What feedstocks are good for New Zealand? Well, it's a hard question because feedstock depends on the scale of your operation, but what dominant feedstocks are there in New Zealand? Well, the dark blue overwhelmingly is the in-forest residues from the logging operations. We've also got the next one up there, the orange colour is municipal wood waste, construction wastes. Then you've got orchard residues, some wood processing residues from the wood processing industry at sawmills and so forth. And you've got on the top there straw and stover residues. So the quantities of these are millions of tonnes on a per annum basis. So they're sort of averaging over future years around about 5 million tonnes of available biomass. But what's important for a good biomass? What properties does it need? Well, a good biomass needs to be low in moisture, because if you've got high moisture, you've got to evaporate the moisture and you've got to use energy, and energy means fuel. You're either having to use some of your biomass or you're having to use an auxiliary fuel like diesel or, you know, coal, natural gas to drive off that moisture. So you want low moisture content. The other thing, if you're after carbon sequestration, you need a high carbon content. So what are things that have got low carbon? Manures have low carbon contents. The digestate from an anaerobic digester at the city waste treatment plant is lower carbon than the fresh biosolids that went into it. Then, depending few feedstocks. So we're asking the question, how much fertilizer is there in biochar? The feedstocks are on the left-hand side. At the top, we've got 3 woods. And you can see the 2 pines, one is made at 450 and the next one's made at 550, and then you've got some eucalyptus. They have got their NPK listed in red. These numbers are low. So what does that mean? Woody feedstocks are nutrient poor. They don't have much NPK. They have high carbon. That's a good thing. Then you've got ones towards the bottom there, which include some biosolids or cattle manure or poultry litter. These have high NPK. But as you can see with the 2 manures at the low carbon content. So you're winning on your fertilizer, you are not winning on the carbon. Depends on what your use is. So what does that mean in terms of dollar value? Does that fertilizer content have a dollar value? And here is some analysis on those same feedstocks. And what we've got there is some calculations that have been done determining what is the value of phosphorus, what is the value of potassium, what is the value of magnesium, lime, net liming content, and adding those up. And so you can see that the values range between, from a fertilizer value, as low as almost nothing for pine chip, which is in the second to last right column, up to over near $130 per tonne for one of the poultry litters, the second from the left-hand side. So that's very interesting, isn't it? That we've got some reasonable value there when the fertilizer is considered. What we've got on the top, we've got these black bits, right? What is the carbon storage value? This is a high, because there is no carbon storage value at the moment. But if we said that the carbon in the biochar had value, and this was priced at 35 New Zealand dollars a tonne of CO2 equivalent, okay. Today's price, I understand, I got told Mike Headley was in contact with me today, looked it up, $53 a tonne is today's value. So all the figures I'm going to give you in this presentation are out of date with respect to value of storing carbon. But if we add that on, we get further value, but we can't add that on at the moment for biochar. Okay, so let's have a think. Is there a soil carbon storage value in New Zealand? Well, I've just answered that, no. Biochar needs to be considered as part of the overall soil carbon in New Zealand. If you put it in the soil's already got some soil carbon, okay? So what are New Zealand's soil carbon levels? This is calculated from New Zealand's greenhouse gas inventory. And if you look at these numbers, the first column is the averages, and then you've got the confidence intervals, you know, either side in the next 2 columns. So look at the averages. So they are around about 100 tonnes of carbon per hectare. New Zealand soil carbon levels. So the question then is, if you were to add biochar to that, what would happen? Okay. Okay, we've got the thing. What we don't know. What don't we know about biochar and New Zealand soil carbon levels? We don't know whether adding biochar to that soil will enhance the native organic carbon or not. Okay, and we suspect it will enhance it. We will suspect that it will mean that any native soil organic carbon is retained for longer in the soil because the biochar is there, because we see those soils in the Amazon, but New Zealand is not the Amazon, and New Zealand soils are not the same soils, but we don't know, and that's where long-term studies need to be done. The next question: how would adding biochar change soil carbon levels? Well, this is the diagram of the emissions from the sectors of the New Zealand economy. And we are reasonably familiar with this, is that energy is quite a lot. That's the red, followed by industrial processes in the orange, and then agriculture, as we know, is about 50% of New Zealand's emissions. The waste sector has a little bit. New Zealand includes Tokelau in its accountings. That's why there's a column for Tokelau, but it's a tiny little island. And then you've got the reduction on those emissions. So the gross emissions go all the way up to the top line, and that is reduced because of land use and forestry. So the IPCC recently developed the framework for countries to allow them to allow biochar into their inventories. That's just a framework, and as far as I know, it is being only thought about at the moment. So what would happen if we used biochar in soils? Well, the idea is that right-hand column, if we had more biochar, we would have a bigger reduction. We would be taking some of the residues, certainly from the waste sector, and using them, and also some of the land management practices would include biochar. So we'd be enhancing that drawdown of carbon through use of biochar. And there's the little arrow that shows you that it would come down. So what does sequestration mean? What does that really mean? What's the word sequestration? Well, it's the conversion of carbon from a form that will readily decay, because if you put biomass in the soil, it will rot, and within a few years it will be gone. Okay, and we're converting that into a form that will be stable and will stay in the soil for more than 100 years. Okay, and the degree to which it does this depends on the production temperature. So this graph here has got something called the hydrogen to carbon ratio in the feedstock as it's converted by thermal processing, and the oxygen to carbon ratio. And what we see, if you look at the temperatures, the little triangles, which are black, biochar made at 300 degrees, okay, right down to the ones that are purple, which is made at 700 degrees. Okay, so we're getting very low H to C ratios and very low oxygen to carbon ratios, and it's that ratio that is related to the temperature. And so what that means is that the IPCC have effectively established that if you make biochar at 600 degrees or above, then after 100 years, 89% of that carbon will still be there, because it's been turned into a stable form. Okay, if you're making it at lower temperatures, 300 to 455, then after 100 years, 65% of it will be there. And those are the numbers that we need to use when we're doing the 100-year forecasts on sequestration. So how is the sequestration potential calculated, I mean to say, for biochar? Okay, in principle, and this is a fantastic diagram from Layman, in principle, about half the carbon in the biochar can be captured in the biomass can be captured. So take this tree here, which on the left-hand diagram would normally live its life, fall over, rot, decay, may go into some soil carbon for a while, but eventually will go back to the atmosphere. So that cycle is continual, it goes round and round, and there's no net accumulation. If we take that tree and at its end of life turn it into charcoal, then the process of making the charcoal will lose about half of the carbon, and the other half will end up in the biochar. Now, as a tree is half carbon, that's why there's the 25% there. The mass of the charcoal is about 25% of the original dry mass of the tree. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because the process of making the biochar have some emissions associated with them. Okay, in reality, there's an emissions cost to producing biochar. So what does that look like? Well, we've got the carbon in the biochar that we saw in the last diagram from Lehman, but we've got to subtract off that carbon any carbon in fuel that we might have used in the production, subtract off any carbon in the power generation that was used for the electricity we might have used in running our plant. And then we have to subtract off effectively the global warming potential of any gases that are emitted from our stack that are not just CO2. When combustion is not very good, you'll get gases such as carbon monoxide and methane being produced, as well as particulate, and they all have an impact, and they have to be deducted from the carbon in the biochar as well. So let's have a look at what that means in a production process. This here is a schematic of the Massey reactor that you saw before, and here's the carbon in the biochar. Hasn't turned black in my picture, but it will. Here is our system used LPG to run our auxiliary burners and our flare system here. There was a little bit of electricity used because we ran some blowers to blow these burners. And then we've got the emissions that come off the top here, which we need to account for the carbon monoxide and methane in those. So the question then is, how serious are the stack emissions, okay, of greenhouse gases? Well, this is our earlier version on the left-hand side, where we've got a nice dark smoke coming out of the top. Emissions control was quite poor there. We upgraded it and we got fabulous emission control. And we reduced emissions quite substantially. So to show you the effect, we had the flare, and this little diagram shows you the flare here, either off or on. And what we're getting here is we're getting some plots of data. So I'll just explain the data. The plot has temperature versus time in hours. So our reactor here, its temperature is the red line. It would increase and it would stay constant at around 200 degrees, and then it would gradually increase, in this case up to 700 degrees after 3.5 hours. The black line is the temperature at the top of the flare, which is being rising up around 800, close to 1,000, and back down again until we turned it off. Now, with a flare system, you're wanting to get your material to 750 degrees for more than 1.5 seconds of time to ensure you burn off any of these products of incomplete combustion like carbon monoxide and methane. What we've got here is on the right-hand column axis, we've got the gas concentrations of both carbon monoxide and methane. So the average numbers are the ones to look at. They are much, much lower. And really, if we take it as a round number, the emissions are 100 times worse when there's no flare. Okay, so it is reasonably essential to have good emissions controls, because if we've got 100 times more CO and 100 times more methane, we have to add on the multiplying factors for the amount that there is, because methane over a 100-year time frame is 28 times worse than carbon dioxide. So we've got to multiply the amount that we detect by 28 to get the equivalent emission, right? If we take it over a 20-year time frame, which the IPCC is now published and encouraging people to use because it's within our working careers, it is 84 times worse. So you can see it is important to keep those emissions of these products of incomplete combustion to a minimum. So next question. Are there guidelines for biochar production? Well, these are our guidelines. Temperature is very important. I haven't talked about that in detail, but the highest treatment temperature should exceed 550 degrees. That's to get the long life of the stable carbon in the soil. The soak time, that's how long you hold it at that temperature, should be sufficient. And that's to do with getting the batch of material all evenly heated. Emissions must be minimized. Otherwise, those emissions, the global warming, will quickly annul any benefit in the sequestered carbon. Thermal oxidizers are needed with biomass, and that's because unless it is really, really dry wood, this flare will not run hot enough to get rid of all of the particulate and products of incomplete combustion. So you need a flare system that can turn up and turn down. It needs a very, very high turn down ratio to cope with that. And of course, if people are selling biochar, then the production facilities do need to be certified so that they are actually selling biochar that hasn't been associated with high emissions. So those are our guidelines. The next thing we come to, well, how much does it cost to produce biochar? Well, it depends on the scale. You can have a small unit that sits on the back of a truck and goes out to a farm, or you can have a large stationary unit where the feedstock is brought from the farm to the production unit. In this scenario, you can see it's going to cost more in terms of transport to bring the material to the plant and then take it back to wherever it's going to be used. Imagine it's the same field. But when you've got a large plant, you've got other economies of scale that you can do something with your flammable gas and your liquid separation, get the watery phase and the oily phase apart, and then reburn the oily phase, and you can get this cogeneration of heat and power. Well, it turns out when you do the analysis that the costs approximate production, large scale production, small scale 3,400 tons a year, biochar made just under $400. Sorry, everybody, I just dropped out there for a minute, but I'm back on. So what I was just saying, I'm not quite sure which sentence I dropped out on, but it's about 400 make biochar, and independent analysis seems to give a similar number. It will depend on feedstock processing costs. Now, if we take that $400 and say, what would that be? Yeah, for some reason.
Jim, we lost your presentation there.
Sorry, you've lost the presentation.
Yep.
Okay, I'll just reshare it. I dropped out for some reason.
Yeah, I know. I don't know what happened there.
Have we got it back, Nathan?
Yep. So I've just started that at the beginning of that slide. That's where you dropped out.
Do let me know if there's a problem. and this slide. So production is about $400 a ton. Okay, and I will try to move through to the next.
And Jim,
Yes.
can we just take your video off? Because you seem to be dropping in and out.
Okay, I'll take my video off. Okay, so
We've lost you completely now, Jim.
yep, am I good now?
You're good now. Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, so continuing here on this slide, $400 a ton. What does that mean when we wanting to convert that into the value as a carbon sink? And what I'm saying here is that if the value of a ton of carbon dioxide rose to somewhere between $125 and $149 a ton, the would be virtually free, because that would cover the cost of production. Okay, so as we know, our price of a ton of carbon dioxide is rising. It's $53 a ton as of today. And so, not that it's going to get to 149, does point out when that making biochar becomes more economic if it could be claimed as a monetizable carbon sink. So here we go. Let's ask this question. Imagine I'm someone who has some biomass residue. I'm thinking about biochar. So I ask my question, is it the best thing to do, or should I do something else with the biomass? So the question really is, in other words, what is the best use of biomass, and is the best the most economic or lowest environmental impact? And ideally it will be both of those, right? The best use of biomass is what we're asking. Well, we also need to ask all these other questions. What is the business as usual? What happens to that biomass normally? What are those costs, if there are costs associated with? What is the profit? Are those costs rising? And is there a changing attitude to the emissions from the business as usual case? So effectively, is the social license to operate evaporating? And then we have to think, well, there might be more than one possible alternative to biochar. So do the other alternatives repurpose that residue? Do they have less impact on the environment? And are those alternatives more or less palatable to stakeholders? So really it needs to be done on a case-by-case basis. Okay, and when it comes down to the environmental impact, if an alternative is more costly, a key comparator is what is the relative cost of abatement. So how much extra does it cost to remove 1 ton of carbon dioxide compared to the business as usual? And I'll come back right at the end to this concept of the cost of. So, question then. Has a study been done in New Zealand comparing biochar to other uses of biomass? And the answer is a study has been done on Great Mark in Marlborough by us. So what is Great Mark? Well, Great Mark is what is left over after the grapes have been squeezed of their juice, which goes on to make wine. That Great Mark in the past was put into agricultural stockpiles. Then those stockpiles needed to be repurposed. So there were attempts at composting. There's a sign there. These are all media photos, by the way. where there's a sign that says compost pad, but it looks more like a stockpile to me. And more recently, the grape mark has been taken out to paddocks without any vines in them and ploughed in, and crops growing on that. And that's been done at a rate that complies with the nitrogen loading levels. So what did we do in our study? Well, the problem was that there was quite a lot of leaching going on in those days of agricultural stockpiles and early attempts at composting, such that wine growers were becoming prosecuted. So we were contacted by the Marlborough District Council to look into alternatives so that we could effectively provide the industry with what other things could be done with that biomass. So there are numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on this diagram. So at the moment, grape mark is the land spread. As I said, there is some composting going on. Composting costs more than land spreading, but we looked at other alternatives of drying out that grape mark and using that as a product. And once it's dried, we looked at combusting it to make electricity, gasifying it to make heat and power, or making a biochar, which is number 6. So that's the one that interests us in this presentation. We did a Techno, Enviro economic analysis. So the Techno works out the capital cost of the plant that you need and the operating cost of the plant. The environmental analysis is done by life cycle assessment. So this is just a diagram that shows you how we set it up. So for composting, we have our fresh grape mark coming to the composting facilities, and these are the steps of the composting facilities. And at the end of it, it goes back out and is spread back out on land, and it carries with it its NPK, I call that the fertilizer value. If we're doing combustion, we have to arrange things such that we deliver the same fertilizer value, but combustion doesn't make fertilizer, it makes heat and power. So what we're doing is we're making heat and power, and then we're going to someone like a dairy factory and we're saying, well, if you use the heat we've produced to help dry your milk into milk powder, that will mean that you don't need to use so much coal. So there's a coal replacement there, but because you haven't you've used it all up and you haven't made fertilizer, some more fertilizer has to be made. And the same idea for making biochar. So these are just the way we do it, and to illustrate that. So what do we find is that by doing life cycle analysis, we come up with what we call a carbon footprint. How many kilograms of carbon dioxide are produced, emitted, by processing 1 tonne of raw grape mark? Well, composting has a small emission because you've got to transport the stuff to the facility. You've got to put it in windrows. Windrows have to be turned every couple of days to start with, decreasing over time as it matures. And so there's a cost to that. If you're doing combustion, there's also a cost, mainly around the initial drying of the material. If you're doing gasification, you actually have a net sequestration. That's because gasification has a tarry char that's produced, which offsets the emissions required to run the plant. If you're making biochar, you're actually sequestering 225 kilograms of carbon dioxide per tonne of raw grape mark, which is a fantastic result. The right-hand column looks at the case where you're offsetting any heat produced with coal. So that means you've gone along to, say, a dairy plant, and you've said, look, use our grape mark, we'll make some heat for you so you don't need to use so much coal. So that's where that comes in. And because you're not using coal, you get a saving. And those give the best environmental outcomes. But that is only a first mover advantage. Only the first person who goes to a big user of coal and replaces their coal can claim that offset. Beyond that, you're back in the left-hand column. Okay, so biochar by far and away is the best environmental footprint. When we did the economic analysis, what we find is that there is a cost to each of these activities. So land spreading has a range. You either make $6.80 or you can spend up to $13. And the reason being is that because the grape mark is taken to a field, it carries with it its fertilizer value when it is put in that field, even though the wine growers have got to pay for that transport and everything. There is a gain, a one back at the field level. Composting is an activity which requires turning and a lot of hold up for many months, and that has a cost of $16 to $22. These are both quite a bit cheaper than combustion. The cost is $42 per tonne of grape mark to actually combust to make electricity. You don't win that back in terms of the electricity because electricity is very cheap. In New Zealand, gasification costs you a lot more. It's a lot more complex process, and so it's quite uneconomic. Biochar isn't cheap either, at $55 to $56 of cost per tonne of grape mark. Okay, and if we included the carbon storage value priced at a couple of months ago on the NZ ETS at $37.50, then that reduces that by $6 or $7. It would be reduced by more now that it's $53 a tonne. So what we need to think is, what is the abatement cost? We really want to compare the pyrolysis for biochar to something like composting. Composting, if we remember, had emitted 20 kilograms of carbon dioxide per tonne of grape mark. Biochar sequesters 225 tonnes per tonne of grape mark. And so we have a thing called the abatement cost that says between these two, there is a net cost of reducing a tonne of carbon dioxide, which is $43. Now that, as I've said here, is not far above. In fact, that's not far now below the New Zealand unit price for carbon dioxide. Okay, so it shows that the abatement cost, if things were monetizable and able to be compared between activities, then that would be covered by the New Zealand unit price. So I'm pretty much near the end now. What is the future of biochar in New Zealand? Well, when we consider it in terms of if it were able to be included as a recognised carbon sink, then the economics start looking a lot more promising. So really, we're trying to drive towards saying that biochar needs to be recognised as a carbon sink into soil, of course, because that's where it goes. We also need, alongside that, production standards and biochar quality certification. The IBI, International Biochar Initiative, and the European Biochar Initiative have both set standards for these sorts of things that New Zealand can adopt. Field trials are needed across many sectors of the agricultural economy. These field trials need to be tied to the agronomics so that investors can assess biochar relative to other uses for biomass, so that it can produce accurate life cycle assessments, so that we can calculate that environmental impact, which is needed when we translate those results into the national greenhouse gas inventories. So there is an opportunity, thank you for listening, for you to ask questions. So I guess it's over to you, Nathan, to lead that. Thank you very much.
All right, Jim, it's fun to watch this. I sorry you haven't paid attention to your presentation that much, just trying to keep up with the questions, but we've got probably about a dozen or so questions here that, yeah, some good questions. Somebody wanted to know what stover was.
Oh, okay. Stover, like, you know, with wheat, you have straw. Well, with corn, you have stover.
Okay.
So it's what's left after you've taken the crop, the wheat kernels or the corn kernels away.
Yeah. They wanted to know what the name of the Australian company supplying biochar furnaces was.
Oh, that was called Earth Systems.
Okay. And then is it fair to index the price of biochar to the price of carbon in the New Zealand ETS? That the price was.
That's a good question. My feeling is we have to go that route, of course, to get things started. But really, when you have the ability to grow a tree, which costs you almost nothing apart from some planting costs, and you are able to claim the carbon in that tree, as long as you don't cut down that tree, you're fine. But the issue being is that that tree will, if it's never cut down, will mature, and then it will be in a forest that will no longer have any accumulation of carbon after 50 to 100 years or so. Beyond that, the only way to accumulate carbon in New Zealand really is through the soils. And so if you can continually put biochar in soils, and we know that biochar will not disappear from soils, then that accumulation should be possible. But the problem being is with this equivalence issue is that it costs a lot more to make that stable form of carbon. And so I would love the idea of it being worth, something, a factor which is bigger than one compared to another form of carbon. But yes, that won't happen, obviously.
Yep. The other question, one of the other questions, were the values that you use for biochar from different sources when you were doing your analysis?
Those in that analysis I did towards the end, we calculated those. But in terms of this is the cost of production, I mean, is this, and the other one I said was an independent one, was just as an example. But I did have, when I presented to the Ministry for Primary Industries, another table which had a whole lot of literature estimations of different values of biochar, or costs of production, I mean, of biochar, and they ranged enormously from somewhere around $1,000 a tonne down to less than $50 a tonne, whereas we're sort of using a number which is around $400 a tonne.
Okay. The other question, and I think we've answered this one, but I'll still ask it anyways, because you might go into more detail. It says, if raw timber containing carbon is buried in the soil, won't it be as effective as burning it and then returning it as biochar?
No, because how much timber do you find buried in the soil? But if you go up to the central North Island, you'll find a lot of charcoal in the ground from the big Lake Taupo eruption, 1,850 odd years ago. So
We lost you again, Jim.
soil, it won't take long for the the grubs to get in there and eat it up, and the fungi and things breaks it down pretty quickly.
Yeah. The other, can you capture the stack emissions via some other process?
So partially, yes. So the stack emissions from pyrolysis will have in them a lot of you would use that oil to run a burner to get a clean combustion. So effectively, what you're doing via another exercise to win you back some green energy is you're actually doing the same thing as our high efficiency flare does. You're trying to turn any of the emissions back to basic carbon dioxide and water. If you were to collect the bio oil, which is has two phases, a watery, oily phase, if you were to collect that, you have to do something with it. You just can't say, I'm not going to emit it to atmosphere. So where else are you going to emit it? Then you've got to work with your other emissions categories, which is to water, to groundwater, and investigate the effect that you would have there.
Yep. Okay. This says, apart from sequestration, I believe if used in horticulture to reduce burning, it also reduces carbon being released in the atmosphere. So it's beneficial in that respect as well. Is that correct?
Yes, and there's a very good example of that in the United States at the moment with the Western states and the forest fire issue, which is effectively the same thing. They're going in with very simple char making machinery, which has high emissions, but what they're to avoid other catastrophic quantities of burnable material on the ground in the forests, and so the same concept can be applied to an existing practice. So, say an orchard to make biochar, and in assuming that the actual emissions that they had from that biochar making were the same as the combustion, they would only produce half as many of them because the other half of the carbon would be retained in the biochar. So the answer is yes, that would be a better activity than just burning, but you would need to keep an eye on the emissions, because a very well constructed fire
We've seen
so,
that. Yep.
so yes, I would get I would actually set some measurements up and watch that. But yes, it would be a better activity is the short answer.
Okay. What measurement equipment did you use in your analysis of the stack gas emission?
We've got a stack analyzer, so we were measuring our hydrocarbon emissions, our carbon monoxide, our carbon dioxide, our oxygen levels, our NOx, our SOx. Yeah, so we were taking samples from that to measure.
All right. It says, can't you use the gas for the heating process to lowering emissions in the process? If you sell the gas as heat, then would it not be better utilization of the material and the byproduct gas?
Yes. So that's where I put that diagram up of the two scales of operation. So a small scale mobile unit on the back of a truck has difficulty selling heat because it's out at the farm, right? But if you have a centralized plant where you bring everything to the plant, then that plant can make heat and sell it over the fence to whoever might need that, tomato house or a dairy factory or whatever, So yes, those economies are there, and we did investigate the costs associated.
We lost you there, didn't you?
The issue with biochar is that it's so light that it costs a lot to transport because the truck's got almost nothing in it.
Okay. Yep. All right. Well, the other question goes right into that. How much of raw material is needed to produce a ton of biochar?
Now, so really, as little of dry biomass to make a ton of biochar. Okay, as little as that. That's the smallest amount, because your yield is not going to get a lot better than 25% practically. However, if you are using your biomass to create the heat, the initial heating, you will use a lot more. And so you get these type of kilns like Kontiki kilns and so forth, where you are using about 10 tons of biomass up to make a ton of biochar. because you're using quite a bit of your biomass to create that flame curtain that goes on top. So any of those emissions associated from those sorts of kilns need to be deducted off the amount of char you've made. But if you've actually got quite a bit more material going in to make that ton of char, you can see how the numbers are not working in your favor.
Okay. Yep. We're slowly getting through these. Is there some way to get your biochar tested to see how good it is?
Not that I know. No, I mean, in terms of this testing service, no, I don't know of a testing service. But you know, that's something that needs to be there, because if we're going to have a biochar market, we need that biochar to meet certain quality specifications. And the European and the IBI and the US have certainly set out what these need to be. But yeah, there's not, as far as I know, a commercial testing lab that do that, but other people may know.
Yeah. The next question is actually an interesting one, and I've got just an addition to this one. It says, has there been any trials done with burning gut pouches on from the butchers? And then also I've got a chicken industry, that's egg industry, that they wanted to know if they could biochar their chickens.
Yes, very interesting, because I have done a project there where we investigated paunch grass from cattle, actually, as a feedstock. I've never ever considered chicken or duck paunches. Stomach contents. The poultry industry have a lot of chicken litter, and they will also have a lot of deceased birds in the production as well. And so I imagine if it's dry enough, then it should the energy balance should work out to throw the odd chicken in there as well. I don't know.
Yeah. So the other question around is CCA treated post and using those for biochar, and could they use them for biochar? There's been a little bit of discussion on this one, but it'd be interesting to get your viewpoint.
Oh yes. Well, so for those that don't know, CCA post, that's copper, chromium, and arsenic. So it's a treatment that's applied to woods, particularly posts, to prevent fungal decay and other bacterial decay of those when they're in the soil. Now, it's well known that they do leach, not quickly, but they do leach over their lifetime. These are all heavy metals, and the arsenic is the problem when it comes to pyrolysis. So arsenic is in the post in a pentavalent form and will decay to a trivalent form. The trivalent oxide will volatilize at some temperature somewhere above 300 degrees. So any pyrolysis process has to be very, very carefully temperature controlled to not bring those temperatures too high, because if they are, some of that arsenic is lost to the vapor stream. It is almost all condensable into the bioliquid, and very little does escape out as gas, but there is a risk there. And those who might be aware might have seen there was a sort of media furore in Marlborough, because a company had proposed to to do a service, I guess, to the region, because there's an awful lot of vineyard posts pulled out of every year, and they're all CCA treated, and they're building up as a big stockpile sitting at the landfill. And we're effectively looking at saying, well, we can reduce the volume of these wastes if we do this. And so, there was a lot of public concern about that, such that it would have made it a very difficult process to go through to getting resource consenting for that. So in principle, yes, it can be done, but there has to be very, very careful controls on facilities that would make char from these. The other issue is, can you call something like that biochar? when it has got the char, which is where most of the heavy metals reside, well, they will still be there. The chromium will pretty much all be there, copper as well, and it's only a little bit of the arsenic that will have gone off. Are these things able to be used as biochar and put back in the soil when the heavy metals are in them? That's a discussion beyond this this talk, but yeah, it really is an issue that would need to be debated before that were allowed. Yeah.
So your cost, did the cost of the manufacturing analysis include the cost of the plant, or did it assume that all the equipment was paid for?
Yes, cost of the plant as well. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. When you did the comparison with the composting, did you include that composting produces methane?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And a little bit of nitrous oxide as well. Yeah.
Yep. And with the grapes residue, is there a similar analysis process happening for forest residue?
In terms of a study, not that we've been associated with, but I don't know, and I don't know of one being done like that. No. Okay. Yeah, someone needs to fund that sort of thing. That's why we're calling for more studies. And forest residue is an obvious one because it's our biggest resource.
Yep. Well, hopefully we've got a few forestry people on here, so hopefully we get a little bit of uptake there. Yeah. Are there any benefits incorporating biochar in the soil in addition to the fertilizer value?
Yes, so I might not have covered those quite as well as I could have. So because biochar is both porous and has a high internal surface area, the porous side, it means it can hold moisture. And in soils that drain very well, it's an advantage to hold moisture. Because it is porous, it can also hold air, which is good for soils that are very clayey and have a poor ability to be aerated. So you've got both sides of the equation there. It gives extra drought resistance in soils, and it also at a sort of I guess microbial or fungal level, it provides effectively a home for these organisms, which gives the soil a little bit more resilience from a ecology point of view, which I guess in terms of, I don't know quite how that affects things like crop yields, but it certainly, as regards to an ecologist, the health of the soil is an advantage. So the adsorbency, this high surface area, is good for holding nutrients. So it's good where there are pollutants around, like at old sheep dip sites. It's good for keeping those heavy metals from moving through the soil. And it's also good for just slowing down the movement of other nutrients, such as nitrates, that would otherwise leach out of the soil.
Yeah. So on that, we'll just continue on that. There's a lot of questions around this, and what kind of studies have been done on productivity in crops with biochar?
Now, so Marta, who's our soil scientist, was part of, she's done a lot of work, but she's also part of a large meta-analysis study that looked at all of the publications that had been that reported on soil studies of yields and productivities, and they looked at all of the factors that are involved, it's very, very involved. Soils are complex things, so there are conditions where the biochar really does increase the crop yields, and there are other conditions where it doesn't make a difference.
Okay. Still in that vein is what's the process of incorporating it into your soil? You might not be able to answer this one, especially, I got one here. It's about steep forestry slopes. How do you incorporate biochar into those soils?
Yes. Well, I guess if that slope is actually normally covered with grass, then it would probably be like you would do with a lot of other things with grass, is you would expect the worms to move things into the soil gradient just by turning soil over, and particles move down through the soil gradient, and you'd put things on top in a particulate form. If you were in a more arable place, you would be best to put that into the soil, and in some of those systems which effectively make a slurry and inject the slurry, would probably be a very good way to do it.
Okay. Is there any commercial sized plants in New Zealand?
Yeah, the one that I showed the photograph of, Waste Transformations have got a, they're not actually operating at the moment, but their plant there is that one with 4 different batch kilns. With it, that's got proper emissions controls on it, so you know, it won't be producing lots of products of incomplete combustion or anything.
Okay. The Great Mark study that you did, it does not credit any biochar to gasification. What was the basis for that decision?
We did the study. The technical side of it, the capital cost of a gasification plant is high compared to the other types of activities, and that high capital cost follows through all the economic analysis. So we did our economics on a 25-year plant life using a 5% cost of capital. Yeah, it's just you're trying to recoup a large capital cost over a 25-year period. So your net cost per ton of Great Mark is, you know, more than double.
Yep. I'm going to flip through a couple of these real quick, and some of them are sort of repeats, and we've covered them. So the other one is bioavailability of NPK and biochar manures compared to what's manures being composted.
I didn't quite catch the question, Nathan.
Yeah, so can you comment on the bioavailability of NPK in biochar manures versus manures being composted?
Yeah. So I can, because when you make biochar, you tend to lock the nitrogen that was in the biomass. Effectively gets locked into the aromatic structures, so it's not that available anymore afterwards, but the P and the K remain there, and they are available, and they are easily accessible for plants.
Yeah. If you making biochar out of crops, what's impact does like Roundup and that kind of thing have on the end product?
I have no idea.
Okay. It says connection between Terra Pretis soils and biochar.
Okay, so just a very brief, I guess, a little bit of history there in terms of a long history lesson is that the area in the Amazon which has been modified by use of biochar is supposedly about the land area of France, enormous area. And so this was traditional living where people were and it seems to have been from as a result of pottery making and things like that, because there's often a lot of pottery shards as well. And where they find the settlements, it's a lot richer nearer the settlements than it is further out. I guess as the fields were further out, they didn't carry it quite so far. And so that was put in, but they were also probably doing some hunting in the forest and things nearby, and so there was always a net movement of other nutrients, nitrogen rich nutrients, I guess, from carcasses and so forth into that. So it's
We've lost you there, Jim.
For
Sorry.
a long time. Oh, did I drop out? Did I?
Yeah.
Sorry
I'm gonna pretty much call us in the next 3 minutes, but just real quick, I'm just looking through, one asks if biochar can use as soil enhancer for microforests. I assume the answer would be yes.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It says, can a homemade drum and funnel device be used to produce real biochar?
Oh yes, I mean at home you can make biochar that way. Yes.
And this is actually really an interesting question. The stability of biochar in the soil, is it the same as if it was in the soil or on top of the soil?
Good question. That's a very good question. If it's on top of the soil, it has the opportunity to move through natural surface weathering, flow of water over the surface, and that wind and being ground up to small particles and to move off into the rivers.
All right, we just lost you again, Jim.
Oh, so I just said that if it's on the surface,
Yep.
it has that opportunity to be weathered. In the surface movement of water and to be ground up more easily, and can end up in the rivers and going out to sea as black carbon more easily. So it doesn't necessarily stay where you put it. If you put it in the soil, it's more likely to stay there.
Okay. All right. I think we're going to wrap it up there, Jim. I appreciate you attending or presenting this. Really good discussions going on.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and yeah, very happy to answer some frequently asked questions.
Yes. And yeah, we'll keep this conversation going on. And as I said, we're going to have a couple of field days, which will generate a whole lot more questions. And hopefully we'll keep getting Jim back on to keep explaining things over the next couple of years. Okay,
well, you're welcome.
All right. Thanks, Jim. And everybody, thanks for attending. And like I said, when we close up, there will be a survey. If you could please fill that survey out, it will be very helpful for us to plan the next biochar event. And thanks everybody for attending.
Okay, you're welcome. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.